So here's a scenario. You recently switch over to Vitest from some other testing library. You have an external link in your app that will reroute the end user to an external web app to monitor the world financial markets. And you know that when it comes to unit testing this link, the better practice is instead of reading the text on the page, get text, you're better off setting an attribute with test ID and then using the get test ID instead of reading the text, because the text may change from time to time outside of your control because this app here belongs to a third party. And then you go to the Vitest documentation and you research the getByTestId function and figure out how that works by reading the docs and following their example. And then you write your unit test following the example verbatim. And you can't figure out why this test is failing. You're getting this error message in the console that says receive value must be an HTML element or an SVG element, which is not very useful at all. Basically, it's saying that you have this value here is null. And you're like, what in the Detroit or Cleveland is going on? Because I'm mocking exactly what's happening in my UI. And your UI is working perfectly. And I've had many people tell me that when they ask for help from Copilot or GPT-4, by the way, GPT-4 is the default LLM for Copilot. You can change that to Claude or some other LLM, but GPT-4 or Copilot would tell them to do this very exact same thing, and they even feed the LLM the error message, but they keep on telling them to do the exact same thing over and over again, causing a failed unit test and a whole lot of frustration. Well, look, I know that some of you are just here to get the quick answer, which is fine. I'll give you the quick answer. But if you want to have a better understanding of how this works and why it's happening, perhaps you are trying to train your local large language model. Perhaps you are running your own local um, AI tool to scrape your company's code so that you can run your own local version of Copilot, if you will, that is private only to your company or your organization. Then hang around. Well, here's a working unit test. And if you watch my previous video on how to set up Vitest, I explain that we need to import testing library and specifically React flavor from testing library. And I explain why this is needed to work with Vitest. The only module that we need from testing library is the screen module, from where we instantiate the get by test ID method to get the test ID, which from the UI is Yahoo Finance. Yahoo Finance. I said earlier that before we imported testing library, if we were to log out uh, the link here, we would get either a null value or some other bull schnitzel. I said schnitzel. Um, so But with the proper importation and invocation of screen and then calling this get test by ID, and if we were to log that out here, as you can see here, is logging out the correct DOM element for us to read this attribute here. If you're wondering why I went with this approach initially, which was with the wrong approach, is because people who came to me for help, They told me this is how they had wrote their unit tests. I'm presuming they followed the example. And if you're wondering about this render method, render comes from the Vitest browser React library, which just came out last year, I believe, so it's fairly new-ish. So um, this allows us to render React components in Vitest browser mode so that we can work with Playwright, which is actually what I'm using here. Playwright is an end-to-end testing library. It's very similar to Cypress, but I think that Playwright is actually better than Cypress, better performance and execution. And so then we just render the component obviously here, right? And then which allow screen module to do his work. And then everything else, the expectation module comes from core Vitest itself. And just quickly looking at the rest of the unit test, very standard stuff, nothing groundbreaking at all. Taking a look at the rest of the setup, for Vitest browser React to work, we need to import Vitest browser. And I mentioned I'm using Playwright. I'm importing that. And then in the Vitest config for the provider, of course, we are going to use Playwright for end-to-end testing. And for a browser instance, we can use Firefox here, but I have a falling out with Firefox. I have a video about that, but I chose Chromium instead. So then what that setup gives me is when I run my test, a browser is fired up for me. And then we can go into Chromium here and see what is testing. Of course, there's the link for that. And then I have another test here this is just a function of a function that I wrote, just some bullshit, so to make sure that it knows how to add correctly and that we can make sure that the test is working properly. I've mentioned previously in other videos that in its current state, in the current time frame, AI is not good at setting configuration or scraping configuration and learning from configuration. AI might be good at coding because it's basically just regurgitating what it's been trained to do. But when it comes to configuration, because there are so many different variables, at the current time, it's not good at that. That could change in a few months, in a few years, who knows? But currently, we need to train the the model ourselves for it to understand configuration. That's why I mentioned that if you are working with a large language model locally and training um, locally, then you need to learn how things actually work. Um, if what I'm saying in terms of large language model prompt engineering, if that doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever, don't worry. You're gonna find out about it here soon. Okay, my friends, thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful. I know many people have asked me about this. If this was useful for you, please consider subscribing to my channel. It doesn't cost you anything and it'll help me out in the future. Thank you for watching again, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.